I stood alone at my husband's funeral, staring at 3 empty chairs reserved for my parents and my best friend. They promised to be there yet when it mattered most. They vanished. The silence from those vacant seats cut deeper than any words of condolence from strangers. As mourners whispered sympathies I barely heard, one question consumed me: where were the people who claimed to love me? What I would uncover in the days that followed would shatter everything I believed about family, loyalty, and the true nature of those closest to me. My name is Madeline Carter, and today I buried my husband alone. The funeral home's fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow over the polished mahogany casket where Daniel lay, his firefighter's uniform pressed to perfection one final time. I had chosen the corner chapel modest, intimate, just the way he would have wanted. Folding chairs arranged in neat rows faced the altar, and in the front row, 3 seats remained conspicuously empty despite the small reserved cards I had carefully placed there the night before. Mom, Dad, Olivia. The empty chairs seemed to mock me, their burgundy fabric untouched by the weight of the people who should have been there. I kept glancing back, expecting to see them rushing through the doors with apologetic faces and breathless excuses. The service was supposed to start at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, but I had delayed it by 20 minutes. Then another 10, hoping against hope they would appear. They never did. Captain Rodriguez from Daniel's firehouse delivered a eulogy that brought tears to everyone's eyes except mine. I had cried myself dry over the past 3 months watching my husband waste away. Mrs. Henderson from next door squeezed my shoulder and whispered that Daniel was a good man. Sarah, my former colleague from the ICU, pressed a sympathy card into my hands. Even the mailman, Tom, who barely knew us beyond our daily hellos, showed up in his dress uniform to pay respects. But my own parents, the woman I had called my best friend since we were 7 years old, nowhere to be found. As Father Mitchell spoke about love and loss, I found myself studying those empty chairs with a mixture of disbelief and growing rage. Just last week, when I had called to confirm the arrangements, Mom had assured me they would be there. "Of course we'll be there, sweetheart," she had said in that practiced tone she used when she was only half listening. 2 o'clock, St. Mary's Chapel. Olivia had been even more emphatic. I wouldn't miss it for the world. Maddie, Daniel was like a brother to me. The lie tasted bitter in my memory now. Throughout the service, I caught glimpses of sympathetic faces turned my way, the kind of looks reserved for the truly pitied. They weren't just mourning Daniel. They were mourning for me, the woman so alone that even her own family couldn't be bothered to show up. The whispers were subtle but unmistakable. Poor thing, sitting there all by herself. "Where's her family?" "That's the friend she always talked about. Isn't it the empty seat?" The shame burned almost as hot as the grief. This was supposed to be about Daniel, about honoring the man who had spent his life running into burning buildings to save others. Instead, it had become a spectacle of my abandonment. When the service ended, I stood by the casket accepting condolences like a robot programmed for politeness. Handshakes, hugs, promises to call if you need anything. The firefighters formed an honor guard as we moved Daniel to the hearse, their crisp salutes a stark contrast to the chaos in my chest. At the cemetery, under a gray November sky that seemed to mirror my mood, I watched them lower my husband into the ground. The sound of dirt hitting the casket was final in a way that the hospital machines going silent hadn't been. This was truly the end. As people began to drift away, I stood there clutching the folded flag they had presented to me, its weight both comforting and crushing. My phone buzzed repeatedly in my purse, probably more well-wishers, or maybe finally some explanation from the people who were supposed to love me most. I didn't check. I couldn't bear to read another excuse, another lie wrapped up in false concern. The funeral director approached gently. "Mrs. Carter, is there anything else we can do for you today?" I shook my head, not trusting my voice. What I wanted to say was that yes, There was something he could do. He could bring back the 3 people who had promised to be here, who had let me face the worst day of my life completely alone. But funeral directors weren't magicians, and some betrayals couldn't be undone with sympathy and soft voices. As I walked back to my car, passing the last few lingering mourners, I made a silent promise to Daniel and to myself. I would find out why they weren't here. I would uncover whatever had kept my own flesh and blood, my oldest friend, from showing up when I needed them most. What I would discover would make me wish I had left those questions unasked. I met Daniel Carter on a Tuesday evening in October, 3 years ago, when exhaustion had become my constant companion. I had just finished a brutal 12-hour shift in the ICU, watching over patients whose lives hung by threads thinner than the ones holding my own sanity together. The smell of antiseptic still clung to my scrubs as I wandered into the Book Nook, a cramped little used bookstore on Maple Street that stayed open late for insomniacs and night shift workers like me. I was browsing the self-help section, ironic, considering how helpless I felt most days when a deep voice behind me said, "Rough day." I turned to find a man about my age with kind brown eyes and soot still visible under his fingernails. His hair was disheveled, and he smelled faintly of smoke, but not the cigarette kind. It was the honest smell of someone who ran toward fires instead of away from them. "Every day's rough," I replied, then immediately regretted how bitter I sounded. "Sorry, I don't usually talk to strangers about my problems." He smiled, and something about it made my chest feel lighter for the first time in months. "I'm Daniel. Now we're not strangers." We talked until the bookstore owner, Mrs. Kim, politely reminded us she was closing at 11:30. Daniel had been looking for a cookbook he was trying to learn how to make something other than frozen dinners and takeout. I had been searching for something, anything, to help me sleep without dreaming about the patients I couldn't save. "Coffee tomorrow?" he asked as we stood on the sidewalk, our breath visible in the crisp autumn air. "I know a place that serves breakfast all day, perfect for people with backward schedules." I almost said no. My parents had raised me to be cautious, practical, focused on career advancement. Dad was a successful investment banker, Mom a real estate attorney. They had expectations, and those expectations didn't include dating men who risked their lives for strangers' benefit. But something in Daniel's eyes, a warmth that reminded me why I had become a nurse in the first place, made me nod. Yes. Our first date stretched into 6 hours. We talked about everything and nothing: his love for old movies, my secret addiction to terrible reality TV, his dream of maybe becoming a fire safety instructor someday, my fear that I was burning out before I turned 30. He listened like my words mattered, like I mattered. The second date was a walk through Riverside Park. The third was dinner at a hole-in-the-wall Italian place where the owner's grandmother still made the pasta by hand. By the fourth date, I knew I was falling for him, and by the look in his eyes when he laughed at my terrible jokes, I suspected he was falling too. When I finally introduced him to my parents 3 months later, the temperature in our dining room dropped 20 degrees. Dad barely looked up from his salmon, asking perfunctory questions about Daniel's career trajectory and long-term financial goals. Mom smiled her practiced hostess smile while making pointed comments about the challenges of marrying someone in a high-risk profession. "It's just that we want security for you, darling," Mom explained later, after Daniel had left. "Firefighters don't exactly build generational wealth." "He saves lives, Mom." "Yes, well, doctors save lives and make better livings doing it." Olivia's reaction was more subtle, but somehow worse. She had been my best friend since 2nd grade, the sister I never had, the one person who supposedly knew me better than anyone. When I brought Daniel to her housewarming party, she was all smiles and warm hugs. "He's cute," she whispered in my ear while Daniel was getting us drinks. "Very wholesome." The way she said wholesome made it sound like a disease. Over the following months, Olivia would make little comments that felt like paper cuts. "Daniel's so lucky to have found someone with your stability." It must be nice for him, knowing he doesn't have to worry about impressing anyone. You two are just so comfortable together? Comfortable. As if comfort was something shameful. As if the way Daniel made me feel safe and valued was somehow settling for less. When Daniel proposed a year and a half later, he did it simply, perfectly. No grand gesture, no public spectacle. Just the two of us in our favorite booth at the diner where we'd had our first date, and his grandmother's ring, a modest pearl surrounded by tiny diamonds that caught the light like captured stars. "I can't promise you wealth or glamour," he said, his voice shaking slightly, "but I can promise you'll never doubt that you're loved." I said yes before he finished the sentence. My parents' reaction was predictably lukewarm. "Well, if you're sure this is what you want," Dad said, as if I'd announced I was joining a cult. Mom suggested we take some time to really think it through and hinted that perhaps I should explore other options before settling down. Olivia's congratulations felt performative, accompanied by a joke about how I was beating her to the altar and questions about whether we had discussed finances thoroughly. But in Daniel's arms that night, with his grandmother's ring on my finger and his quiet certainty surrounding me like a blanket, their disapproval felt distant and unimportant. I had found someone who loved me not for my potential or my pedigree, but for exactly who I was. I thought that would be enough to weather any storm. I was wrong. We found our house on a rainy Saturday in March, 6 months before the wedding. It was a 1950s bungalow on Elm Street with peeling paint, a sagging front porch, and a for sale by owner sign that had clearly been there for months. The realtor my mother had recommended wrinkled her nose the moment we pulled into the driveway. "There are much better properties in Westbrook Heights," she said, consulting her tablet. "Your budget could stretch to something much more appropriate." But Daniel was already walking the perimeter, running his hands along the foundation, checking the gutters with the practiced eye of someone who understood how things were built. I watched him through the living room's grimy windows as he knelt to examine the front steps, and something about his focus, his genuine interest in this imperfect little house, made my heart skip. "The bones are good," he announced when he came back inside. "Solid foundation, newer roof, original hardwood under this carpet. She just needs some love." The house had 3 small bedrooms, 1 bathroom with vintage pink tiles, and a kitchen that hadn't been updated since the Carter administration, the Jimmy Carter administration. The backyard was overgrown with weeds, but there was an old apple tree in the corner that still bloomed despite years of neglect. "We could make this beautiful," Daniel said, pulling me close as we stood in what would become our bedroom. "Picture it refinished floors, fresh paint, maybe knock out this wall to open up the kitchen." I could picture it. More than that. I could picture us in it. Daniel reading the Sunday paper at a kitchen table we'd refinished together, me tending a garden where the weeds now grew. Someday, maybe children playing under that apple tree. We made an offer that afternoon, $15,000 under asking price. The elderly owner, Mrs. Patterson, accepted it the next day with the condition that we could take possession immediately. She was moving to Florida to live with her daughter and wanted the house to go to young people who would love it. My parents were horrified. "Yeah, you're buying a fixer-upper." Mom's voice reached a pitch only dogs could hear when I called to tell them. "Madeline, sweetheart, think about resale value. Think about the neighborhood. Think about what this says about your future prospects." "It says we're building something together," I replied, but she had already moved on to lecturing me about property taxes and home inspections and the wisdom of waiting until after the wedding to make such a significant financial commitment. Dad was more direct. "If you insist on this project," he said the word like it tasted bad, "at least let me connect you with a proper contractor. You can't seriously be planning to do the work yourselves." But that was exactly what we were planning. Every weekend became an adventure in home improvement. Daniel taught me how to strip wallpaper, a tedious process that involved more swearing than I'd done in my entire life up to that point. I taught him the difference between eggshell and satin paint finishes, knowledge I'd acquired from watching too many home renovation shows during sleepless nights between shifts. We started with the bedroom, painting the walls a warm gray that made the morning light look golden. Daniel installed new ceiling fans with the concentration of a surgeon, consulting YouTube videos and muttering about electrical codes. I tackled the bathroom, scrubbing decades of soap scum off those pink tiles until they gleamed like new. The kitchen renovation took 3 months of Saturdays. We tore out the old linoleum to reveal gorgeous oak floors that just needed sanding and staining. Daniel built new cabinets from scratch, measuring twice and cutting once while I painted them a crisp white that made the small space feel twice as big. We splurged on one thing, a vintage-style refrigerator in mint green that made me smile every time I walked into the room. Olivia visited exactly once during those months. She arrived on a Sunday afternoon in designer jeans and spotless white sneakers, picking her way carefully through our construction zone. "It's very ambitious," she said, watching Daniel wrestle with a particularly stubborn section of crown molding. "Though I have to ask, wouldn't it be easier to just buy something that's already finished?" "Easier. Maybe," I said, handing Daniel a different drill bit. "But this way it's really ours." She nodded like she understood, but I caught her taking photos when she thought I wasn't looking, not the proud kind you share on social media, but the kind you send to friends with laughing, crying emojis. My parents came by exactly once as well, the weekend before the wedding. Mom walked through the house with the expression of someone touring a crime scene, commenting on the cozy rooms and the quaint fixtures in a tone that made both words sound like insults. "Well," Dad said finally, standing in our newly renovated kitchen, "I suppose it has character." But Daniel didn't seem to notice their lukewarm response. He was too busy excitedly explaining the crown molding he'd installed and the way we'd opened up the sight lines between the kitchen and living room. His enthusiasm was infectious, at least to me. After they left, we sat on our front porch swing, one Daniel had found at an estate sale and painstakingly restored. The street was quiet except for the sound of Mrs. Henderson's wind chimes next door and the distant laughter of children playing in the park 2 blocks away. "They'll come around," Daniel said, though I hadn't said anything about my parents' visit. "Maybe." I curled up against his side, breathing in the scent of sawdust and paint that had become the smell of home. "Or maybe it doesn't matter." "Of course it matters. They're your family." "You're my family now, too." He squeezed me tighter, and we sat there watching the sunset paint our little street in shades of gold and amber. In 6 months, we'd transformed a neglected house into something beautiful, something ours. The future stretched ahead of us like fresh paint on clean walls, full of possibility and promise. On quiet evenings like that, I let myself imagine what came next. Daniel teaching our children to use tools safely, me showing them how to plant seeds in the garden we'd started in the backyard, family dinners around the table we'd bought at a flea market and refinished ourselves, grandchildren climbing that old apple tree someday. Simple dreams, ordinary dreams, the kind of dreams that build lasting happiness, one careful brushstroke at a time. I should have held on to those moments more tightly, should have memorized the way Daniel looked when he was proud of something we'd built together, the sound of his laugh echoing through rooms that smelled like fresh paint and new beginnings. Because I didn't know then how quickly it would all be taken away. The headaches started 3 months after our second wedding anniversary. At first, Daniel brushed them off as stress from the new training program at the firehouse. He'd come home rubbing his temples, squinting against the kitchen lights we'd so carefully chosen, claiming he just needed a good night's sleep. "Maybe you need glasses," I suggested one evening as he sat at our refinished dining table, pressing the heels of his hands against his eyes. "When's the last time you had your vision checked?" 20/20 vision, according to my last physical," he mumbled. "It's probably just the new captain riding us harder. You know how it is with leadership changes." But I was a nurse. I knew the difference between stress headaches and something else. Something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up every time I watched him wince at sudden movements or bright lights. When he started throwing up without warning, violent episodes that left him pale and shaking, I stopped accepting his explanations. "You're seeing Dr. Reeves tomorrow," I announced after finding him on the bathroom floor at 3:15 in the morning. dry heaving into the toilet we'd retiled together the previous spring. "Maddie, I'm fine. It's probably just that flu that's been going around the station." "The flu doesn't last 6 weeks, Daniel." Dr. Reeves, our family physician, took one look at Daniel's symptoms and ordered an MRI. The appointment was scheduled for the following Tuesday at 1:30 in the afternoon. I took the day off from the ICU, claiming a family emergency that felt more prophetic than I realized at the time. The radiology technician was a woman about my age, with kind eyes, who explained the procedure twice, as if she could sense the dread radiating from both of us. Daniel squeezed my hand before they took him back, his palm clammy despite the air conditioning. "Well, whatever it is, we'll handle it," he said, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. The waiting room had pale yellow walls decorated with generic landscapes, mountains, beaches, forests that existed nowhere and everywhere. I stared at a particularly bland seascape while the minutes crawled by, each one feeling like an hour. My nursing experience made the wait worse, not better. I knew too much about what they might find, understood too well why Dr. Reeves had seemed so concerned. When they finally called us back to the consultation room, Dr. Reeves was already studying the films on his computer screen. His expression told me everything I needed to know before he spoke a single word. "I'm going to refer you to an oncologist," he said gently. "Dr. Martinez at University Hospital. There's a mass in your frontal lobe that needs immediate attention." The words hit like a physical blow. Daniel went very still beside me, his breathing shallow and controlled in the way I recognized from emergency calls at the firehouse, the calm that comes before action, before the full reality hits. "How immediate?" I heard myself ask. "I've already called Dr. Martinez's office. She can see you tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. The drive home passed in silence. Daniel stared out the passenger window while I navigated traffic that seemed surreal in its normalcy. People going to grocery stores, picking up dry cleaning, living their ordinary Tuesday lives while our world tilted sideways. Dr. Martinez was brilliant, thorough, and brutally honest. The tumor was aggressive, inoperable due to its location, and had likely been growing for months. Stage 4 glioblastoma. Even with treatment radiation, chemotherapy, experimental protocols, the prognosis was measured in months, not years. 6 to 18 months, she said, her voice professional but not unkind. "We'll do everything we can to extend that timeline and maintain quality of life for as long as possible." Quality of life. The phrase felt obscene when applied to a 31-year-old man who ran into burning buildings to save strangers, who built kitchen cabinets with his bare hands, who still left me notes in my lunch bag on days when our schedules didn't align. I called in sick to work that afternoon and drove to my parents' house. Mom answered the door in her tennis outfit, racket in hand, clearly on her way out. Madeline. What a surprise. I was just leaving for my lesson with Patricia. But she stopped when she saw my face. "What's wrong?" I told them everything about the headaches, the diagnosis, the timeline we'd been given. Dad set down his newspaper and actually looked at me, really looked for the first time in months. Mom sank into her chair, her tennis racket forgotten. "Oh, sweetheart," Mom whispered, "I'm so sorry." For a moment, I thought this might bring us closer. That crisis would strip away their disapproval and leave only love, only family supporting family through the unthinkable. "What can we do?" Dad asked. "Do you need money for treatments? I could make some calls, get you in touch with specialists?" "We have good insurance through the fire department," I said. "But thank you. I needed to tell someone." "Of course!" Mom reached over and squeezed my hand. "We're here for you, both of you. Whatever you need." I called Olivia next, catching her between meetings at the marketing firm where she'd been climbing the corporate ladder with single-minded determination. "Jesus, Maddie, I don't even know what to say." Her voice was thick with what sounded like genuine emotion. "How are you holding up?" "I'm not sure yet. It doesn't feel real." "Well, what do the doctors say about treatment options? There have to be options. I explained Dr. Martinez's plan, the aggressive treatment schedule that would likely consume the next several months of our lives. Olivia listened without interrupting, asking practical questions about work and finances and logistics. I can help, she said when I finished. Whatever you need rides to appointments, grocery shopping, someone to vent to at 2 in the morning. You know I'm here for you guys. That night, Daniel and I lay in our bed, the first bed we'd bought as a married couple, chosen because it fit perfectly in the bedroom we'd painted together and tried to process the impossible. He was going to die, not someday in the distant future, not in some heroic blaze of glory saving lives, but slowly, probably painfully, in a hospital bed or in this room we'd made beautiful with our own hands. I'm not ready, he whispered into the darkness. Neither am I. I wanted more time. I wanted to see you become a mother. I wanted to teach our kids to throw a baseball, to change a tire, to stand up for what's right. I turned toward him, memorizing the shape of his profile in the dim light filtering through our bedroom curtains. We'll make the time we have count. Promise me something, he said, taking my hand. Promise me you won't let this destroy who you are. Don't let the grief make you bitter. I promised, though I had no idea then how hard that promise would be to keep, or how thoroughly the people I trusted most would test my capacity for bitterness in the months to come. The first sign something was wrong came 3 weeks after Daniel's diagnosis, when I overheard my mother on the phone in her kitchen. I had stopped by to pick up some casserole dishes she'd offered to lend us small gestures that felt like olive branches after years of cold disapproval. Well, it's tragic, of course, Mom was saying, her voice carrying that particular tone she used when discussing other people's misfortunes. But Madeline is still young. She'll recover from this and hopefully make better choices next time. I froze in the hallway, the stack of Pyrex dishes suddenly heavy in my arms. The life insurance situation is actually quite good, she continued. Daniel was smart about that. At least, firefighters always are, given the risks. Once this is all over, Madeline will be well positioned to start fresh. My stomach dropped. She was talking about Daniel's life insurance while he was still alive, still fighting, still hoping the experimental treatment might buy us more time. I set the dishes down quietly and left without saying goodbye. That evening, I mentioned the conversation to Daniel as casually as I could manage. He was having a good day. The steroids were controlling the swelling, and he'd managed to eat most of his dinner. She's probably just trying to be practical, he said, though something flickered across his face. People don't know how to talk about this stuff. But I was starting to notice other things. The way conversations stopped when I walked into rooms, the look that passed between my parents when Daniel mentioned updating his will, Olivia's sudden interest in our financial situation, asking pointed questions about the house mortgage and whether we'd considered getting our affairs in order. The donation fund Captain Rodriguez had set up for Daniel's medical expenses started disappearing faster than it was being replenished. At first, I assumed it was because we were using it for gas money to drive to the city for treatments, or for the special dietary supplements Dr. Martinez had recommended. But when I checked the account online, I found withdrawals I didn't recognize small amounts, $50 or $100 at a time, always accompanied by vague memo lines like family support or medical assistance. Did you give anyone else access to the fund? I asked Captain Rodriguez during one of Daniel's chemo sessions. He frowned, pulling up his own records on his phone. Just you and Daniel, as far as I know. Though, he paused, scrolling through his messages. Your friend Olivia called last week asking about how to make a contribution. Said she wanted to help with administrative costs. I might have given her the account information. Administrative costs. The phrase sat wrong with me, like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. That weekend, while Daniel napped off the worst of his treatment fatigue, I decided to drive over to Olivia's apartment unannounced. She lived in a trendy complex downtown, the kind of place with granite countertops and a gym in the basement that she'd chosen specifically because it was an investment in her future. I found her in the parking garage, loading shopping bags into her BMW, a car that was definitely newer than the last time I'd seen it. "Maddie." She seemed genuinely startled to see me. "What are you doing here? Is Daniel okay?" "He's sleeping. I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd stop by." The lie came easily, but Olivia's expression suggested she didn't quite believe it. She finished loading her bags, expensive-looking ones from stores I couldn't afford, even before medical bills started piling up, and closed her trunk with perhaps more force than necessary. "How are you holding up?" she asked, but her eyes kept darting toward her apartment building, like she was eager to get inside. "It's hard. The treatments are expensive, even with insurance. Thank goodness for the donation fund Captain Rodriguez set up." Something flickered across her face. "Right. That's wonderful that people are contributing." "Someone's been helping with administrative costs. Apparently. Captain Rodriguez mentioned you'd called about that." "Oh, yes." Olivia's laugh sounded forced. "I just wanted to make sure the funds were being managed properly. You know how these things can get complicated." I studied her face, searching for the friend I'd known since childhood, the one who'd helped me practice for my nursing boards and held my hair back when I was sick with food poisoning freshman year of college. But the woman standing in front of me felt like a stranger wearing Olivia's face. 2 days later, I was sorting through mail when I found a bank statement that had been opened and resealed. The envelope was slightly torn along the edge, as if someone had been careless in their haste. Inside, I discovered that someone had accessed our joint savings account, the one Daniel and I had been building toward a down payment on a larger house someday, back when someday felt guaranteed. 3 withdrawals, each for exactly $1,000, each authorized with a signature that looked almost like mine, but not quite. The timing coincided with days when I'd been at the hospital with Daniel, when our house had been empty except for the spare key we kept under the decorative rock by the front door, a hiding place I'd mentioned to both my parents and Olivia over the years. That evening, I waited until Daniel was settled in bed before calling my parents' house. Dad answered on the 3rd ring. "Madeline, is everything all right? It's almost 10:30. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." A pause. "Of course, sweetheart. What is it?" "Have you or Mom been in our house when Daniel and I weren't there?" Another pause. Longer this time. "Why would you ask something like that?" "Because someone has been in our accounts. Someone who had access to our bank statements and knew where we keep our spare key." "Madeline, you're under tremendous stress right now. Perhaps you're misremembering some transactions. Or..." "Dad." My voice was sharper than I'd intended. "Yes or no? Have you been in our house?" "Your mother may have stopped by once or twice to check on things when you were at the hospital. She was worried about you, about the house being empty. There's nothing wrong with family looking out for family." But the way he said it, the careful phrasing, told me there was much more to the story than he was admitting, and the sinking feeling in my stomach told me that my husband, fighting for his life in the next room, wasn't the only battle I was going to have to fight. I was starting to realize that the people I'd trusted most had been preparing for Daniel's death and planning how to benefit from it long before I'd even accepted that he was going to die. Daniel died on a Tuesday morning in November, just as the first snow began to fall outside our bedroom window. I was holding his hand when his breathing finally stopped, and for a moment, the silence felt sacred, peaceful, even. He looked younger somehow. The lines of pain that had carved themselves into his face over the past months finally smoothed away. It wasn't until 3 hours later, after the funeral home had taken his body and the house felt impossibly empty, that I remembered the envelope. He had given it to me 6 weeks earlier, during one of his clearer days between treatment rounds. We'd been sitting in our living room, the one we'd painted sage green because it reminded us of the park where we'd had our second date, and he'd handed me a manila envelope sealed with packing tape. "Don't open this until after," he'd said simply. "After what?" "You know what?" His voice was gentle but firm. "Promise me. Maddie. Not until after." I'd promised, though the envelope had been burning a hole in my consciousness ever since. I'd kept it in my underwear drawer, hidden beneath the lingerie Daniel had bought me for our last anniversary, delicate things I'd probably never wear again. Now, sitting alone in our kitchen with the afternoon light fading and snow beginning to stick to the windows, I retrieved the envelope with shaking hands. Daniel's handwriting on the front simply said, "For my wife," in the careful block letters he'd learned in the fire academy. Inside, I found 3 items: a handwritten letter, a manila folder thick with documents, and a small key I didn't recognize. The letter was 2 pages long, written in Daniel's increasingly shaky handwriting. The medication had affected his fine motor control, but every word was legible, deliberate. My dearest Maddie, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and I'm sorry I couldn't stay longer. I'm sorry for so many things, but most of all, I'm sorry that you're about to discover some very ugly truths about the people who should have been protecting you. I know you've noticed the missing money from our accounts. I know you've had suspicions about your parents and Olivia. You're right to be suspicious. They've been planning for my death since the week I was diagnosed. My hands began to tremble as I read on. I hired a private investigator, Jim Morrison, not the singer, just a guy from Cleveland who used to be a cop. The key in this envelope opens a safety deposit box at First National, box number 247. Everything Jim found is in there, but I've included copies of the most important documents here. Your parents have been in our house 17 times since my diagnosis. Olivia has a key. She made a copy from the spare key months ago. They've been going through our papers, photographing documents, and yes, stealing from our accounts. The bank statements will show you exactly how much. I set the letter down and reached for the folder with numb fingers. The first document was a bank statement highlighting withdrawals that totaled nearly $8,000. The second was a series of photographs that made my blood run cold. Pictures of my parents and Olivia sitting together at a coffee shop I didn't recognize, leaning over papers spread across their table. Pictures of Olivia leaving our house on days when I'd been at the hospital. Pictures of my mother photographing documents in our home office with her phone. But the worst was a transcript of a phone conversation, dated just 2 weeks ago. "The house is worth at least $200,000. Olivia's voice was transcribed, saying, "Maybe more if the market keeps going up, and the life insurance is substantial. Firefighters always have good policies. The question is how much of it she'll actually see." My father's voice replied, "If we can establish that she's not capable of managing large sums of money during her grief." "That's where I come in," my mother had said. "Someone needs to help her make rational decisions. For her own good, of course." I read the transcript 3 times before the words fully registered. They were planning to declare me incompetent. They were planning to take control of Daniel's life insurance, our house, everything we'd built together. Daniel's letter continued. "I've changed everything I can legally change. The house is now in your name, only I signed a quitclaim deed that's already filed with the county. I've also changed the beneficiary on my life insurance to list only you, with a clause that prevents anyone else from claiming financial guardianship over the proceeds. Most importantly, I've documented everything. Jim has photographs, recordings, and financial records that prove what they've been doing. If they try to claim you're unfit to manage your own affairs, you have evidence that they're the ones who can't be trusted. I wish I could be there to protect you from this. I wish I could spare you the pain of discovering how mercenary the people you love can be, but you're stronger than all of them combined. Maddie, you're the woman who works 12-hour shifts saving lives, who taught herself to tile a bathroom by watching YouTube videos, who held my hand through every terrible moment of this disease without flinching. You don't need them. You never did. All my love, always, Daniel. P.S. There's one more thing in the safety deposit box. Something I want you to have, and something I want you to remember when you're ready to start living again. I sat in our kitchen as the snow continued to fall, surrounded by evidence of betrayal so comprehensive it took my breath away. The people who should have been grieving with me, supporting me, helping me through the worst loss of my life, had instead been calculating how to profit from my husband's death. The anger that rose in my chest was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It was clean and sharp and incredibly clarifying. Daniel had known, somehow, even while fighting for his life. He'd been watching out for mine. Tomorrow was the funeral. Tomorrow, my parents and Olivia would show up with flowers and sympathy cards and perform grief they didn't feel for a man they'd never respected. They would expect me to lean on them, to need them, to be so broken by loss that I'd gratefully accept their help managing my affairs. They had no idea that Daniel had just handed me the weapons I needed to destroy them all. But first, I had a funeral to plan, and 3 empty chairs to prepare for people who'd already shown me exactly who they really were. The morning of Daniel's funeral, I called each of them one final time. My mother answered on the second ring, her voice carefully modulated in the tone she reserved for delicate situations. "Good morning, sweetheart. How are you holding up? I wanted to confirm you'll be there today. 2 o'clock at St. Mary's." "Oh, darling, I'm so sorry. Your father woke up with terrible food poisoning something from that new sushi place downtown. I can't possibly leave him alone, and he's in no condition to travel. We're just devastated to miss it, but I'm sure you understand." Food poisoning. From sushi they'd eaten at 11 o'clock the previous morning. According to the social media post Mom had forgotten I could see, the timing was almost insulting in its obviousness. "Of course," I said. "Family comes first." My father got on the line, his voice weak and theatrical. "Madeline, honey, I'm so sorry. If there was any way—" "Don't worry about it, Dad. I understand completely." Olivia's excuse was more elaborate. She was stranded at the Atlanta airport, she claimed, victim of a sudden business trip that had been absolutely unavoidable and a connecting flight that had been mysteriously canceled due to weather that didn't exist. "I'm sitting in the airport right now crying," she said, and I could hear the carefully orchestrated emotion in her voice. "I can't believe I'm missing this. Daniel would be so disappointed in me." "He would understand," I replied. "Business emergencies happen." "I'll make it up to you, I promise. We'll have our own memorial service when I get back. Just you and me." "That sounds lovely." I hung up and sat in the silence of our living room, surrounded by the sympathy flowers that had been arriving all morning. Their absence wasn't a surprise, it was confirmation of everything Daniel had discovered. They couldn't risk being seen publicly mourning a man they'd been planning to profit from. Someone might remember their faces later, when questions were asked about the missing money and forged signatures. At 1:15, I drove to St. Mary's alone. The funeral director, Mr. Henley, was waiting with his usual professional compassion. "Mrs. Carter, is there anything specific you need before we begin? Any last-minute arrangements?" "Could you please leave 3 chairs empty in the front row, right here?" I pointed to the spots directly across from Daniel's casket. "I want them to stay empty throughout the service." "Of course. Reserved seating for family members who might be running late?" "No, just empty." The service proceeded exactly as I had envisioned that morning I'd stood alone at the funeral. Captain Rodriguez delivered his eulogy with genuine emotion. Daniel's fellow firefighters performed the ceremonial last call over the radio. Mrs. Henderson dabbed her eyes with tissues. Tom the mailman stood at attention during the honor guard presentation. And throughout it all, those 3 empty chairs sat like accusations in the front row. After the burial, I returned home to find a car in my driveway. Not my parents' Mercedes or Olivia's BMW, but a silver Honda I didn't recognize. The front door was unlocked. They still had keys, apparently, and I could hear voices coming from my kitchen. I walked in to find all 3 of them arranged around my dining table like a board meeting. My parents had somehow recovered from their food poisoning with miraculous speed. Olivia had apparently caught an earlier flight from her fictional emergency trip. Spread across the table were sympathy casseroles, a fruit basket, and a bottle of wine props for the performance they were about to give. "Madeline." Mom jumped up and enveloped me in a hug that smelled of expensive perfume and insincerity. "Oh, sweetheart, I'm so sorry we missed the service. How did it go?" "Your father's feeling much better," she continued without waiting for an answer. "And Olivia managed to catch a red-eye flight. We wanted to be here for you afterward, when you really need us. Olivia was next, tears streaming down her cheeks with professional precision. I can't believe I missed saying goodbye to Daniel. I'm so sorry. Maddie, I know how important it was to you that we be there. Dad remained seated, playing the role of the still recovering invalid. We brought some food, he said weakly. Thought you might not feel like cooking for a while. I looked at the three of them, my parents who had raised me, my best friend since childhood, and felt nothing but cold clarity. They had orchestrated this absence, this perfectly timed arrival, this careful performance of regret and support. They thought they were dealing with a grief-stricken widow who would be grateful for any crumb of affection they offered. That's very thoughtful, I said. Please, sit down, all of you. They settled back around the table, their faces arranged in expressions of practiced concern. Mom poured wine without asking, as if alcohol would make the conversation ahead easier to navigate. Now then, Dad said, clearing his throat. I know this is difficult timing, but there are some practical matters we should discuss. Financial arrangements, legal issues, that sort of thing. You shouldn't have to handle all of this alone. The house, for instance, Mom added. This place is far too big for just you, and the upkeep must be enormous. We've been thinking you might want to consider selling, maybe finding something smaller and more manageable. Olivia nodded sympathetically. And there's Daniel's life insurance to consider. These things can be complicated taxes, investment options, making sure you don't make any hasty decisions while you're grieving. You're all so concerned about my welfare, I said. Of course we are, Mom said. Your family. Family. I repeated the word like I was tasting something bitter. Let me ask you something. When exactly did you become interested in my financial well-being? The three of them exchanged glances, quick, subtle looks that confirmed they'd rehearsed this conversation. We've always been concerned about your future, Dad said carefully. Have you? I stood up and walked to the kitchen counter, where Daniel's manila envelope sat waiting. Because I have some interesting documents here that suggest otherwise. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Olivia's tears stopped flowing. Mom's wine glass paused halfway to her lips. Dad's recovering invalid act faltered just enough to show the calculating mind beneath. Madeline, Mom said slowly, what kind of documents? I smiled, the first genuine smile I'd felt in months. The kind that explain why none of you could make it to my husband's funeral. The kind that show exactly how much you've stolen from us over the past 6 months. The kind that prove you've been planning this conversation since the day Daniel was diagnosed. The silence that followed was beautiful in its completeness. No more lies, no more pretense. Just 3 people caught red-handed, and one widow who was about to show them exactly how strong grief could make a person. Now then, I said, opening the envelope, let's discuss those practical matters you're so concerned about. I spread the photographs across our dining table like playing cards in a high-stakes game. Bank statements, transaction records, pictures of them entering my house when they thought I was at the hospital, the transcript of their phone conversation about my supposed mental incompetence. This is you, Mom, I said, pointing to a photograph of her using her phone to capture images of our financial documents. And this is you, Dad, discussing how to establish that I'm unfit to manage Daniel's life insurance. And Olivia. I held up the bank statements showing the forged withdrawals. This is your handwriting, almost like mine, but not quite. Olivia was the first to break. Maddie, I can explain. No! My voice cut through her words like a blade. You can't explain stealing $8,000 from a dying man's medical fund. You can't explain making a copy of our house key without permission. You can't explain planning to have me declared mentally incompetent so you could steal my husband's life insurance. Dad tried to salvage the situation with bluster. Now, see here. Madeline, we were trying to protect you. People in grief make poor financial decisions, and we thought. You thought I was weak. I turned to face him directly. You thought I was the same little girl who used to call you crying when college got overwhelming. You thought grief would make me desperate enough to hand over everything Daniel and I built together. Mom's composure finally cracked. We are your family. We were looking out for your best interests. My best interests? I laughed, and the sound was sharp enough to make them flinch. My best interests would have been having my family at my husband's funeral. My best interests would have been emotional support instead of financial scheming. My best interests would have been parents who loved me more than they loved money. I pulled out another document, the quitclaim deed Daniel had filed without telling them. Here's something else you'll find interesting. Daniel transferred full ownership of this house to me 3 months ago. You can't force me to sell it. You can't claim any financial authority over it. It's mine, free and clear. Olivia's face went white. But the mortgage? Was paid off with Daniel's pension fund early withdrawal, another thing he did without consulting any of you. I pulled out the life insurance documents. And this policy, the one you've been salivating over for months, I'm the sole beneficiary. No co-trustees, no financial guardians, no provisions for anyone else to manage the funds in case of emotional distress. The three of them sat in stunned silence as the magnitude of their miscalculation sank in. They had planned so carefully, manipulated so precisely, stolen so methodically, and Daniel had outmaneuvered them at every turn. But we're family, Mom whispered. No, I said, my voice steady as stone. Family doesn't steal from each other. Family doesn't abandon each other during the worst moments of their lives. Family doesn't conspire to profit from tragedy. I gathered up the documents and tucked them back into the envelope. Here's what's going to happen. First, you're going to return every penny you stole. All $8,437. I have account numbers and transaction records, so don't bother claiming you spent it. Dad opened his mouth to protest, but I held up my hand. Second, you're going to give me back every key you have to this house. Right now. Olivia fumbled in her purse and placed a key on the table with shaking hands. My parents followed suit, their movements mechanical with shock. Third, you're never setting foot in my house again. You're not welcome at family gatherings I might attend. You don't get to call me when you need something. You don't get to pretend this conversation never happened. Madeline, please, Mom began, tears now streaming down her face. We made mistakes, but we can fix this. We can... You made choices, I corrected, and choices have consequences. I walked to the front door and held it open. Get out! They filed past me in silence. 3 people who had gambled everything on my grief, making me weak and lost spectacularly. At the threshold, Olivia turned back one last time. I really did love him, you know. Daniel was a good man. If you had loved him, I replied, you would have been at his funeral. I closed the door behind them and turned the deadbolt with a sound that felt like victory. Alone in my house, truly my house. Now I poured myself a glass of the wine they'd brought and walked to the window overlooking our backyard. The apple tree Daniel and I had planned to someday watch our children climb stood bare against the November sky, but its branches were strong, its roots deep. I had lost my husband, but I had found something else, the knowledge that I was strong enough to stand alone, fierce enough to fight for what was mine, and wise enough to know the difference between people who loved me and people who only loved what I could give them. Daniel had been right. I didn't need them. I never had. And for the first time since his diagnosis, I felt ready to discover who I could become without their shadows dimming my light. Thank you for listening to my story. I'd love to know where you're hearing this from. Are you driving to work, walking your dog, or maybe lying in bed thinking about your own relationships? Please comment below and let me know where you're listening from so we can connect. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel and share your own thoughts about family, loyalty, and finding strength in unexpected places.